The phrase that we hear in the groups that should terrify everyone, not terrify, but I think maybe a lot of people could resonate with this, is people say, I could never talk about this with my doctor. What does that mean? It means that everyone's just lying to their doctor.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with James Maskell, who's a serial healthcare founder, author, and speaker. James is on a mission to flatten the curve of healthcare costs and has spent the past decade innovating at the cross-section of functional medicine and community. To that end, he created the Functional Forum, the world's largest integrative medicine conference with record-setting participation online and growing physician communities around the world. His organization and best-selling book of the same name, Evolution of Medicine, prepares health professionals for this new era of personalized participatory medicine. His new project, FindFunctional, makes functional medicine affordable and accessible for all. He's an in-demand speaker and impresario, being featured on TEDMED, HuffPostLive, and TEDx, as well as lecturing internationally. He lives in Sacramento, California, with his wife and daughter. Thank you so much for joining us today, James.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's lovely to meet you. And I am really excited to dive in and talk about how did you actually get into this area of functional medicine?
So I'll start right at the beginning. So I was born into an intentional community in Colorado. My parents were part of a spiritual community that had sort of centers around the world. And I lived in England and South Africa, but I was born in America. And that community was really involved in the really early days of what I would call professional natural medicine, like natural medicine being done by doctors, chiropractors, and other types of practitioners. So I was born into that. And so my healthcare team growing up was a chiropractor and a homeopath. And, I didn't set foot in a medical facility for, the first 13 years of my life. So that was kind of like what I just thought was normal. And I didn't realize that was abnormal until I went to school and realized like no one knew what any of those things were. And now I'm in school in the UK. And I guess I thought maybe my parents were insane. And I thought like everyone else knew what was going on. And I sort of had a rebellious phase where I thought I needed to be an investment banker. I did a degree in health economics. And what I recognized in that degree was that the costs of healthcare, both in the US, where we have this sort of hodgepodge of government payers, employers, and individual payers, and in the UK, where you have a single system, like single payer system, where the government pays for everything. In both of those situations, the cost is going up exponentially and is completely unsustainable and will bankrupt both countries in my lifetime. And so, that was always in the back of my head. And ultimately, I started a job being an investment banker. I realized it wasn't as cool as it's kind of made out to be in, media or otherwise. And I decided to quit that and really try and find out, what is driving this. I knew that it was chronic disease just from, the literature and through my degree. But I wanted to find out what's going on with chronic disease. Why is it so prevalent? What's driving it? And is it reversible? And so I moved to America in 2005. I saw chronic disease being reversed. I worked at a clinic which had a naturopathic doctor, and I saw people transform. And that was like my first data point. And I knew that it was possible, but I saw it happen. And then I started working with other doctors and all kinds, like chiropractors, naturopaths, Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, Reiki, like the full gamut of, different operating systems of medicine. What led me to functional medicine was really that what I saw in the alternative medicine world is that everyone's talking their own language. Like the Ayurveda people don't talk the same language as the Chinese medicine people, who don't talk the same language as chiropractors, even though those three disciplines, even though they developed independently, are actually remarkably similar in the way that they think about the body, how it heals, and how it works. And so when I came to functional medicine, when I started going to conferences and I saw Dr. Jeffrey Bland and Dr. Mark Hyman speak, this is kind of like 2009-ish, I realized, one, here was a fully organized system where you could actually have a common language for all those kind of providers to work together into teams, and that ultimately a common language was going to be needed for scale, but also that it had enough science and enough momentum to really bring conventionally trained medical doctors to the party, as it were. And so, those things combined made me think, okay, here's an operating system of care that might be able to bring together all of these seemingly disparate strategies into one. And, since 2014, I've been very actively and centrally involved in scaling up the delivery of functional medicine.
I didn't grow up in an intentional community. I actually I'm on the advisory board of an organization that's creating one right now, and have a lot of people in my life who are actually creating them. And I'm curious from your perspective, how much that experience, I totally get that, the types of care and the models of care that were available. What it sounds like I heard you say is the types of care that were available in that particular community were different than the types of care that were available in other communities. Is that the gist of it? Why you started getting curious about that?
Yeah, well, I kind of, I was curious about it. I mean, in the intentional community, everyone was there was a kind of energy healing that everyone was taught to do, which is similar to Reiki, which was called attunement. And everyone had an attunement, a couple times a week given by someone else. There was a valley in Colorado where the community was a biodynamic valley. Like there'd never been pesticides in that whole valley. And the food was delicious, and I milked cows and goats. I used to go there in the summer and, work at the farm. And I just realized, I also realized, my mom, who had no medical training, was right about things that she had no business being right about. As an example, I was the only kid in school. When I went to school after being in the commune, I was the only kid in school whose mom had to be called before I was ever to be able to be given antibiotics by the school nurse. So how did my mum, with no medical training, sort of understand that there were going to be downsides to the overuse of antibiotics in the 80s before any primary literature had acknowledged that at all? Right? So those kind of questions really got me thinking, mix in starting to dabble in a bit of psychedelics living in London. And I was really like, man, I think I might be playing for the wrong team. Maybe my parents were right and I need to go and dive in. And I was probably put on this planet not to be an investment banker, but to further this movement. And ultimately, I'm 15 years into that journey.
How do you think your mom did know that?
It's an understanding of holism, right? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if you put unbelievably deadly things, antibiotic, what does that mean? Against life, right? You put that into the body. If you understand holism, then you understand that, there's going to be some downside to doing that. There may be some upside, and we're very clear on the upside because that's what, pharmaceutical science focuses on. But over time, there's downside. And this might be getting a little bit technical, but in my economics training, I started to understand that through the lens of externalities, right? So negative externalities are things like pollution is a classic example, or antibiotics. You can see it, right? The first dose of antibiotics that's used on the battlefield of World War I is unbelievably valuable. But by the time you're routinely putting it into every cow, right, then maybe there's some downside, on that end. So it's just really an understanding of holism and the fact that there are downstream negative effects to things that may look positive in the short term. And you can see that in healthcare. You can see that in energy production with fracking. You can see that, all of these systems that are sort of collapsing around us are collapsing because we don't take into account the long-term negative external side effects that aren't captured in the existing transaction. And we don't have to talk about economics anymore, but that's just the thesis.
I think it's really important to draw those correlations, actually. And as you were speaking, I was thinking something lately that I've been very obsessed about is how obsessed people are with the microbiome versus the terrain. So the terrain theory versus germ theory. I keep bringing this up with a lot of my guests lately because it feels like once people started talking about the microbiome, it's all they started to do. It feels like there's so much focus on controlling the microbiome now and less focus on the terrain of the body. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it's just the same level of thinking applied to a new thing that they just discovered, right? You're still thinking about it in a very masculine way, which is like, single input, single output. But if there's one part of the body that doesn't really deserve that kind of thinking and needs more of a community focused thinking or a ecosystem thinking, it's the microbiome. So yeah, 100%. And that's why, I think that this next era of medicine is a profoundly feminine medicine because it's focused on empowerment and community and systems thinking. I don't know if some of your listeners are familiar with Alison Armstrong, but she talks about the difference between, men growing up being the hunters and women growing up being the gatherers. Men had to concentrate for 2 days in order to stalk some prey and kill it. So they have to be very focused on one thing. Whereas the gatherers, the women, have to be thinking about what's where at any time and giving sort of the field report. And ultimately, if you take those concepts into medicine, you see the same thing. Men would be like, we got to kill the germ. And the women are like, hang on a minute, we're killing all the other good ones. And I think that's sort of the profound balance that's been way out of balance for too long.
Okay, I really love you, by the way. You're stroking my feminine ego so much.
Well, look, 85% of functional medicine doctors are women, so I'm good at that.
you know your audience, and yes, I love it. And so I wrote a book called The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility, and because you've been talking about field, this is why I'm bringing this up. So one of the areas of concentration for the book is, it's related to creativity. It's related to creating people specifically, right? But sort of any creative endeavor you could apply this to. And there are 4 principles for fertility to consider. One is they're kind of no-brainer gardening references, but the seed, you have to have the seed and you need the season. It's got to happen in the right season. You got to plant in the right season. You got to do it. The field, and then the water. So the field piece of that, this is I call them the 4 fertility factors. The field piece of that is just so huge. And I feel like this is the area that we're really going to dive into today. And you wrote a book called The Community Cure. That's your latest book. And it sounds like you've been able to demonstrate how the community aspect of group healthcare visits can have a profound impact on the healthcare outcomes. And I guess also when I first heard that, you write about this, I was like, okay, I immediately started thinking of women's circles and women's groups. And that's such a common thing. Or I also started to think about, or Weight Watchers or anything where there's a circle of people healing together. And I'm also you're probably familiar with Dean Ornish's work.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I did some consulting with his group before. So, and I've seen how that work can be applied in a medical setting. And I'm so happy that you're doing this work. But I'm trying to figure out, because I know Dean Ornish had to collect 15 years of medical data in order to get his heart disease reversal program covered by Medicare. How are you finding this to be practically applied, this idea of community cure? And I'd love to hear you talk about what that is and how you're seeing that applied practically in the healthcare setting.
Yeah, look, Dean Ornish is a hero in that he, was at the wall for 30 years, essentially proving that lifestyle interventions delivered in a community setting was great, not just good medicine, but great medicine. I'll come back to Dean Ornish in a minute when I talk about what I'm doing now. But yeah, Dean was one example in my book, The Community Cure, that was really showcasing essentially that this combination of functional medicine as the operating system and group delivered services as the sort of delivery system was the future of chronic disease management and should be the future of healthcare. I don't know how many reasons you want, but the first one I would say is that loneliness is the biggest driver of all-cause mortality. Social stress is way bigger than smoking, alcoholism, nutrition, any of these things that public health spends millions and millions, billions of dollars, trying to change. Loneliness is the biggest driver by far. It's been exacerbated during COVID 100% or more. And, ultimately, we need to solve for that, right? We need to re-facilitate community. And so these groups are really powerful. And then when you start looking into what's happening in groups, when those two things are done together, you see some incredible outcomes. So I know that this podcast has a lot of fertility conversation. So just to give you one example, and this isn't a chronic disease, this is like giving birth, but centering pregnancy is the biggest group delivered service in America right now. They have had, I think, 100,000 patients go through it. All it is putting women who are going to be pregnant at the same time or are pregnant and going to have a baby at the same time into a group together to discuss their experience. And it reduces preterm birth by 35%. And it flattens the difference between Black birth outcomes and white birth outcomes. And it's unbelievably effective. And there's no medicine. The medicine is sitting in a circle and sharing your fears. Like only in the last 200 years, in the whole of human history, only in the last, 100 years, has it been the plan to keep women alone during pregnancy and have them live in singular modular houses and kept away from everyone else. Being alone, historically, when we lived in tribes, would be, unthinkable to have children. You'd be, taken care of by the whole village. So ultimately, there's one great example there, but there are examples in literally every area of chronic disease, pediatrics, Ornish, cardiology, Terry Walls' groups in MS reversal are insane. And if you look across the functional medicine ecosystem at the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine, which is essentially conventional medicine's first moment where a major medical and academic institution is saying, hey, we also believe that functional medicine should be the future operating system of care. In that model, which now everyone that comes through that system has to go through a 10-week, 2-hour-a-week group in order to qualify to see one of the functional medicine physicians there, all on insurance, by the way. The results are spectacular. Half the people reverse their chronic illness in the 10 weeks and never need to see the doctor because you're re-establishing community. And unlike all of the super dysfunctional communities that we've all been part of, like your family or your school or the high school locker room or maybe your first job, all of these communities are started with empowerment and support and mutual cooperation as part of it. And that's really where the functional medicine operating system comes into play, because just like in Ayurveda, we are reinforcing the understanding of the body's innate ability to heal. We are supporting the body in doing that. And more than anything, if we're going to build a healthcare system around behavior change, let's do it in a system that we know works for behavior change. And ultimately, you said Alcoholics Anonymous earlier. If you went to the AMA meeting, the American Medical Association meeting in 1940, and you asked 100 doctors, 100 of them would tell you that alcoholism was incurable. Because guess what? With drugs and doctors, alcoholism is incurable. But if you put people in, support groups and you feed them empowerment, support, and mentorship from people who have already got sober, it's actually not that hard at all. We were just doing completely the wrong medicine. And my thesis in the book is essentially that most chronic illnesses that we see that have a lifestyle component have way more, in connection to, they're so much more like alcoholism than they are being hit by a train. But yet, we go in and we see the doctor and the doctor gives the diagnosis and we get the drugs and we go home and we wonder, why doesn't it work? Why isn't my type 2 diabetes being reversed by metformin and insulin? Well, the truth is it's not designed for that. It can't reverse it. It's physiologically impossible. But being in a group of people where you reduce your sugar and you improve your insulin sensitivity through dietary changes and, reducing stress and all that, it's not only possible, but it's happening. And so it's just a 180-degree shift in like what we should be doing from what we are doing. And that shift is, starting to take hold and happening. And I guess the last thing that I want to say is that just going back to Dean Ornish, look, Dean's amazing. And what he did is incredible. However, the Ornish program has not flourished. And the reason why it hasn't flourished and why it's not available in every cardiologist's office is because by the nature of, Dean wanted to make sure that the protocol worked every time. And so the protocol was actually quite hard to execute. You have to have 6 practitioners working in harness,
It's very specific and very, yeah.
So, what I'm doing now and the work that I'm doing is sort of taking the principles of integrated medicine delivered in a group. And, with COVID coming along and everyone being ready for virtual care, we're going to lead the world in virtual delivered care. And it's unbelievably easy for doctors to execute. They just have to prescribe it and we do it. And, we've got a clean shot here in the next 5 years at really building the system that makes the existing system obsolete, true to the promise of Bucky Fuller.
So I love this idea of, people going into a quote unquote special healing community at some point, right? So around that particular condition. But how specific do you think the groups need to be? Like everybody with, type 1 diabetes is in a group, everybody that has breast cancer is in a group? Or do you think it's actually beneficial sometimes to mix conditions in healing groups?
It's a great question. I'm not sure if I really know the answer. I'll tell you this, specificity is good for recruiting people into the groups, right? Not everyone thinks they need to be in a group, but if you're type 2 diabetic, you'd probably take a chance on a type 2 diabetes group. So for recruitment purposes, specificity is actually very helpful. But I'll just give you my example. Like I'm in a group called Mankind Project. It's a men's group. We meet every week, one evening a week. And, I've seen, it's not medical at all, but I've seen men in my group have dramatic improvements in their health, dramatic improvements in their mental health, transform their personal relationships through accountability and mutual support. And so, I think the truth is it's like all kinds of groups can flourish. In my book, I show, yes, okay, the medical system is a reasonable place to start these groups. One, because sick and lonely people end up in the medical system. And there's also budget also assigned to build these groups, i.e. Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial insurance. But, I think the potential of the community cure, and this potential is being unleashed in certain places around the world that are getting it, is really re-sewing together the fabric of community and the fabric of society. And so I think the potential for it and where you see the most exciting projects grow is really where it doesn't cost anything and it's not in the medical system at all, but it's certainly having medical outcomes because people are empowering themselves to become self-efficacious and leave the medical system behind forever.
If you want to create a more receptive body, free from toxins, inflammation, and metabolic issues, would it be crazy for you to explore booking an Ayurvedic consultation with me? There's probably never been a more perfect time to do it. Every day you wait matters when it comes to your health. So if you're ready to get your body back in balance, I'll give you a 30-day plan to get you started. Go to heathergrish.com to book a consultation. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. What are you finding in terms of the length of time a person should be engaged in a healing community? And I'm not sure if you've even looked at this, but I come from the culture of yoga and Ayurveda where, it's all about, okay, this is my perception of it anyway. I have a stressful job. I'm not treating my body well. I'm stressed out. I'm not doing well in my relationships. I'm disconnected from my body. I need to go and do yoga every day on my mat, after work so that I can de-stress because I'm not living in line with my real truths and connected to my body. And my environment may be a factor in that. And then in order for people oftentimes to really go through a healing, there's this like, I got to go to India and go get panchakarma. And that's to me like a very drastic measure because you have to take a person out of their day-to-day life in order for them to do that, for them to have the cells and the energy and the doshas, as we call them, or the functional humors of the body, begin to reassemble themselves so that the person can start to have a more aligned flow through them. but it's very drastic. And when I think of people going off in community and sort of creating special bubbles in their lives, and I taught yoga teachers for years too. So I totally am like, I totally get the benefits of it. But what's the length of time that we should expect people to be engaged? Is it a permanent thing, or is it you got to then find ways to reintegrate the learnings back into your day-to-day life?
Yeah, look, I mean, the whole point is integration, right? We're integrating, a solution that's like got one foot in the medical system and one foot in community, which is necessary because those two things don't connect up until now. I think for empowered people, it could be as short as 4 weeks, to connect and get into different habits and do it. But ultimately, most people in America are not empowered. And when I say empowered, my definition of that, and not my definition, the king of group visits, Jeff Geller, who I speak about in my book, who, really was the first guy to popularize these in federally qualified healthcare centers with undocumented immigrants, was really that what empowered is like, do you have the ability to make choices? Right. And a lot of times we're like screaming, self-care at people who really need community care. They need, a community of people to reinforce healthy behaviors. They need the support of a community to actually get stuff done. Like if you have 3 kids, 2 jobs, and no car, you're not going to start a yoga regime, right? You may need someone to help you out to get a few hours a week to get to yourself to, put in that kind of self-care. And without the power of a community, without other people, to do, you get sucked in by the social determinants of health, right? And so ultimately, it's the big thing now is social determinants of health. How do we solve the social determinants of health? I have seen no more elegant solution in the world than community as a way of solving for the social determinants of health, because all you're doing is putting people into a group, setting them up into a structure where they start to care about each other, and then having them, share resources and tools to be able to solve each of their problems dynamically.
I want to say that I heard a story about you traveling for a long time as part of your research. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I've been pretty nomadic. My wife and I have traveled a lot. When we left, so everything kind of started in New York. The functional forum started there. That's where I kind of like, I was selling to doctors and I lived in New York for a long time. And then I realized, after I had my daughter, that living in New York with kids was not really that cool. And so we decided to move and we weren't sure where. So we spent the next 22 months without a physical address. We Airbnb'd places, we traveled. I was being asked to speak at all kinds of conferences and getting amazing invites to go to all different types of things because the functional forum really took off. And, where the biggest functional medicine conference was like 1,000 doctors, we had 30,000 doctors watching the show because it was all online. So yeah, we traveled for 2 years there. And then in the summer of 2018, I took a 4-month road trip around the country in a green bus. We are just launching an alternative to health insurance. And I put my family in this bus and we went around the country for 4 months. We did 26 live events and we got to see some of the most beautiful parts of the country. And I got to take my daughter actually to the place where I was born in Colorado to a music festival that is held on the grounds of where I was born. And we made a bunch of other stops en route and it was amazing and horrifyingly tragic at the same time. Not tragic, but just like I wouldn't recommend a 4-month RV trip with a young family while trying to launch a business to anyone.
I'm envisioning it and I'm like, wow, that's tough.
Yeah, we left New York about when my daughter was like, I think 2. But yeah, we traveled a lot, I mean, I grew up going between England, South Africa, and America. So I just grew up kind of gypsy. So did my wife. She had one parent in California and one in Georgia and went back and forth. And so, it was quite easy for us. But, a couple of years ago, I just actually on that trip, I realized we kind of hit the edge of it. And so I've been very happily, honestly, COVID has been amazing because for the first time, like my daughter was 6 months old when I started the functional forum and that really kickstarted a kind of a crazy 7 years. And, just this year, not traveling at all. I was actually in India when COVID happened and I had to like come back on the last possible flight. And then, I didn't travel for 6 months and it was amazing. And I don't think I'm going to travel nearly as much anymore because I quite like being at home now. And I like being at home with my family and I can get my business done and I can do podcasts like this from my shed in the back of my house and all as well.
I feel the same way, actually. I don't really miss traveling that much, I have to admit. I wanted to go back to this idea of the environments that we're in affecting our health. And I know, there's all this research with the blue zones and about, how there are healthy pockets of people. And so when I left my role as head of product development for a health insurance company, I went back to Ayurveda school. So I still did some consulting while I was in getting my master's degree. And one of the projects I turned down when I was in getting my master's degree was for one of the major health insurance companies in the US to write their 5-year strategic plan. That was like one of the last projects I turned down in that industry. And it was actually a company that I really respect. But I'll tell you why I did it. I walked around the office that I was going to be, going into to work with. And I noticed that so many people were obese and didn't look healthy. And then the hiring executive, for example, that I was going to be working with, he told me, you can call me up until, I'm available all the time. You could call me up until 1 a.m. and then again at 6 a.m. And I said, I don't want to work with somebody who doesn't sleep. And has no plan to change that. It was really big for me
Well,
because
it
I
sounds
was
like
in
he
it.
does sleep from 1 till 6.
Yeah, exactly. But I was concerned. I was like, I don't know that I would trust an individual who's not really respecting themselves, because I think, when I was in Ayurveda school, I just was so aware of how much our health affects the integrity of our mind, the integrity of our behaviors, certainly of our bodies, and our behaviors are all interconnected. Like if we're off circadian rhythm, the body's going to suffer. And guess what? The mind is going to suffer too. So I actually started making decisions in my life to be around healthy people. That actually became a priority for me. Is that any part of your work with, like how do you evaluate the health of a group?
Yeah, no, 100%. So actually, my business partner, this new venture, his name's Barclay Burns, and he was the founder of learning.com, which was a significant disruption in the ed tech space. And after his brother died of an overdose, he kind of got active and realized, he did a PhD in the University of Cambridge, and he went actually into Mountain Healthcare in Utah to see, he had full access into, what was happening and what was going on. And what he discovered really that medical systems have no chance of reversing chronic disease for many reasons. But one of the major things is people hate their jobs. And you actually need the outcomes that patients get are directly correlated to the happiness of the providers and the whole teams that are connected. And, we have a profoundly disenfranchised medical community, and we have horrible health outcomes, and they're really connected. And so I think, your intuition that you needed to be around healthy people is very savvy. And ultimately, with this organization we're building, we're only hiring like health coaches who, if you think the average health coach is not a seasoned medical professional, this is someone who got a chronic illness, reversed it, and now want to, with functional medicine or lifestyle, and now want to do a second career where they're able to help other people. And it turns out they're the perfect people to lead these groups because, it's this peer-to-peer dynamic, and it's almost like this mentor role. It's sort of like the sponsor in the AA groups.
Yeah, it's a little almost like a little less authority driven than medicine.
Yeah, I mean, we hear that the phrase that we hear in the groups that should terrify everyone, not terrify, but I think maybe a lot of people could resonate with this, is people say, I could never talk about this with my doctor. What does that mean? It means that everyone's just lying to their doctor. And you know that you do. I mean, let me just ask you what you say when you say, hey, how many drinks did you have this week? And we're building a whole medical system of bad information because no one is in reality about their situation, and no one's communicating to this, health professional about it because of that dynamic. So we have to like flatten the whole thing, and we have to put people in these groups and help them support each other. So that's where we're headed. And ultimately, this is working. And I fully expect this to, become a super, super transformational organization in the next 5 years.
Let's talk about root cause. It's so buzzy. Everybody talks about it. How do you remove the root cause? I mean, when I was in Ayurveda school, it's certainly one of the mantras, like, we're here to remove the root cause. We're here to remove the root cause. And the same thing that happens in medicine, or how, modern medicine has a reputation for not removing the root cause and treating symptoms, yada, yada, yada. But the same thing that happens in medicine could also happen in Ayurvedic medicine if you don't, find the root cause, right? If you're not willing to look at the root cause, or if you can't find it, or whatever the reason is. So I'm curious to hear your take on what you think, how people find root causes, what you think root causes really are.
Yeah. Well, look, you could definitely see there's an obvious juxtaposition between like the example I gave earlier, right? Insulin and metformin for type 2 diabetes. And then you could say, look, the root cause is actually, glucose and eating, all kinds of crazy foods that were never meant to be eaten and drinking Coca-Cola and whatever. So let's treat the root cause. Let's change the diet, right? Or that's one example. Or maybe even for some people who have type 2 diabetes, it's not the food, but it's actually like historical stresses or historical environmental pollution. But, that's an obvious, way, and that's the way that functional medicine communicates the root cause. But ultimately, when you start to see these groups, what you realize is that, the real root cause is that people aren't doing these healthy behaviors consistently, right? And why aren't they doing the healthy behaviors consistently? It's because of trauma, typically, right? It's some sort of trauma that has led to people looking to essentially subconsciously like remain unhealthy because of all kinds of issues and all maybe reasons why you might. And so you have to have the right structure to, start to unpack that. And that's really why the group format exists, to be able to speak truths into a group, to be able to hear other people be vulnerable, which encourages everyone else to be vulnerable. In the first session of our groups, the health coach shares very vulnerably about, their journey and some of the really tough moments in there. And that's a sort of an accelerator for everyone else to realize this is a safe space to be vulnerable. And that's the beginning part of unlocking a lot of the healing. So I don't doubt that there are root causes based in, environmental toxins, but ultimately the body has the capability to remove environmental toxins if the lifestyle is right and if the food is right. And then, the patients and regular people are able to do those things consistently if their mindset and their, is in the right spot and the trauma has been successfully dealt with. And that's no small task. But ultimately, the group is just unbelievably effective at doing it. It's the equivalent of having 15 unpaid health coaches support you in your journey because everyone's supporting each other.
Yeah, when you were talking earlier, I'm such a horrible storyteller, so never gonna do this justice. But I'm remembering this. I think it was a Buddhist story about two monks that were crossing a river, and this beautiful woman came up to the river, and she wasn't able to cross the river. And one of the monks laid down, or like carried her across the river, but she was like beautiful and she was naked, and the monks weren't supposed to look at women. And the monk, essentially helps her across. I don't know if he like puts down a jacket or helps or carries her, but he helps her across the river. And then the other monk, they're walking along afterwards, and the other monk is like, I can't believe you did that. And to me, like when I hear about that, it's just this thing about our minds that hold on to the past. And like when you started talking about trauma and, obviously there are physical traumas, there are mental traumas, and the dynamic between the two, between the physical and the mental, is really something I'm very fascinated by. And yeah, I do agree that being in this supportive environment where you can be heard, and sometimes, the other thing that is really tricky about medicine, I don't know if you'd agree with this, medicine in general, any kind of medicine, but I would say conventional medicine seems to get more of the reputation for being like very problem solving oriented, which doesn't necessarily always allow a person to really look at what's really sink into acceptance with things. Would you agree with that?
It's the male versus female again. Yeah, of course. Male vibe is problem solving, and so that's the energy that comes into medicine. And ultimately, that's not the best operating system for dealing with multifactorial layered chronic illness.
So the bottom line is just everything has to happen in a more feminine way in the future in the whole planet, right?
100%. 100%. Yeah. A cool book if you guys are really into it. My wife read it and read me chapters every night. It's amazing. It's called The Great Cosmic Mother. And it basically talks about these feminine-led societies that existed pre-patriarchy and how they existed and how effective they were and where they went. And the byline is honoring the religions of the earth. And ultimately, I think, I would almost consider myself, pseudo-pagan at this point, because ultimately it seems like the earth is a much more obvious thing to revere than nature. That's ultimately what we're doing is, rebringing medicine around to support the natural world. And, I think that can't happen too quickly.
Yeah, it's like, and to me, it's really correlated with fertility, not just for women and men and having babies, but also the fertility of the earth and restoring the plants and the natural world. It just seems like all really connected for me.
It's all connected. Yeah.
James, it's been so great having you. What did we forget? Anything else important you want to share with the group here?
No, I appreciate the opportunity. Ultimately, I really want to just share my appreciation for you and the work that you're doing, to get this kind of ideas out. I'm excited to jam in the future about reorganizing insurance and, the sort of the health system. I took a big bite, which was to try and build my own alternative to health insurance where all of this kind of medicine could be put at the front of healthcare rather than the last possible thing that you do where nothing else has worked. And, I think I'm very excited about, some of those ideas starting to capture interest, especially in other markets like India, where, obviously Ayurveda rules supreme. So, yeah, I'm excited, to see the journey for both of us. And I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with your audience. And yeah, if people want to get in touch, Instagram, I'm Mr. James Maskell is, you can send me a message on there, pretty easily. The work that we're doing is really focused on transforming healthcare at this moment. And, if you feel like your doctor would like to run some of these groups and you can make a connection, I'd love to hear from you.
And it really is about conscious medicine because, I think the reason that all this is coming up now is because so many people have been into meditation and yoga for so long, and the internal awareness or the interoception, or if you want to call it in the yogi terms, pratyahara, just that inside awareness of our bodies allows us to have so much more ability to detect things early on. And I think we have more people on the planet. I think there's a huge disparity between those who do have the body awareness and those who don't. But for those who do, these front end pieces are possible for people to actually utilize and benefit rather than, going toward the more late stage disease model that we have right now. We can definitely target earlier stage disease, I believe, because the consciousness is raised with a lot of people, but we still need to help a lot of other people as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think that one of the things I sort of talk about at the end of the book is really that how do you create an exponential revolution in healthcare? It's by the learners, the people who learn, becoming the teachers really quickly. And that's why I'm excited about health coaches in this role, is that, as people develop that for themselves, they are then able to support other people in that transformation. And, so there's actually a role for everyone who's listening to this podcast to get the word out and continue to educate their communities, because things are kind of going downhill pretty quickly. And I know that we can turn it around. It'll probably get worse before it gets better, but it's on all of us to participate in that.
You're a ray of light, James. I'm so glad that we met, and I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.